Regarding assessing the risk of bias, do you remember the whole path to get a publication or get a systematic review?
Well, thanks a lot for being here. We had an issue with the microphone. We have two topics here. The first one is assessing the risk of bias, and the second one is regarding an introduction to grade tool or the grade assessment. Regarding this first talk, do you remember the whole path of getting a systematic review published? This is just for you to remember. First of all, we have the formulation of the PICO question. Then we write the protocol for our systematic review, the literature search, then the abstract screening, the full text screening is the next step, then the data abstraction, and the risk of bias assessment, then the data analysis or the meta-analysis, of course the grade, assessing the quality of the evidence, and then we hopefully will get our systematic review published. What is bias? Just for you to remember, it's a systematic error or some deviation from the truth. Of course, it's important to remember that incorrect studies would lead to misleading reviews. Then we're not having good results to apply to our patients, or in the population we want to apply what we found. Why should we believe in the results if they're biased? Perhaps we don't need, or we won't believe on those results. That's why we need to perform a good systematic review and to assess in a very good way the risk of bias and the grade assessment, in order to know if that effect we found is good or not. It's coming from a good evidence or not. Of course, we cannot measure exactly the presence of the bias, but we might for sure try to think what's going on with the conduction of each study. So we could identify what's happening and what would be the affection of the estimated effect after. Of course, bias might over or underestimate the effect. That's important for us to understand how if the effect would be over or underestimated. It's really important to try to figure that out. Assessing the risk of bias is not the same as imprecision, which is related to the random error due to sample variation, and it is reflected on the confidence interval of most of the time, or it's a good way to focus on. Quality sometimes it's reported as the same as the risk of bias, but this is not the same. Of course, we know different tools to assess the risk of bias, different tools to assess the quality of the evidence, but it's not exactly the same, so we have to be careful about it. And reporting is not the same as the risk of bias, is not the same as quality of the evidence. Reporting is regarding if the study had good methods to report the results, to report the methods they use, but it's not the same as quality, it's not the same as precision, and it's not the same as reset bias. We have a lot of different ways to perform a literature appraisal, to perform a risk of bias, assessing the risk of bias, but all of them are not, we did not suggest to use different tools. You just try to get one of them and specialize on that one and try to use it every time you're performing systematic reviews, since it is always important the expertise on each tool. I'm gonna show you different tools, but the focus would be on the Cochrane risk of bias tool, and that is for intervention systematic reviews. That would be for randomized clinical trials. This one was described by Alejandro Haddad. This guy is an excellent person and professional. He was born in Monteria in Colombia. He's one of the first of getting a PhD in knowledge synthesis. He's also an anesthesiologist, and he created this tool to evaluate the clinical trials. And you have 3 simple questions. Was the study described as randomized? Was the study described as double-blind? Was there a description of withdrawals and dropouts? And you give 1 point to each yes and 0 points for each no. You give 1 additional point each if randomization and blinding are appropriate, or deduct 1 point if randomization or blinding were inappropriate. So you have a good score if it had 3 or more in that scale. It's a validated, is recognized on scientific research. You could use it, but Cochrane collaboration always suggests to use the Cochrane risk of bias tool. If you're performing a non-Cochrane systematic reviews, you could use it as well. This is one important. Of course, I don't know if you're gonna have the chance to see all the items there, but let me just read them for you. One is a clearly stated aim, the inclusion of consecutive patients. The third one is prospective collection of data, endpoints appropriate to the aim of the study, unbiased assessment of the study endpoint, follow-up period appropriate to the aim of the study, loss to follow-up less than 5%, prospective calculation of the study size, an adequate control group, contemporary groups, baseline equivalence of groups, adequate statistical analysis. These are important for you to know that this is another way to assess the non-randomized studies. Non-randomized studies. We're not focusing on this kind of tool today, but it's important, since you're gonna have the opportunity during your life of assessing the risk of bias in non-randomized studies. So here you could get some important points. You're not assessing the risk of bias exactly with the same tool for each type of study. For randomized trials, you have one tool. For non-randomized trials, you have the other one, and perhaps we're evaluating some other tools for different kind of studies. This is the other one. This is called the QUADAS 2, QUADAS 2. It's another way to assess the risk of bias, but this is for diagnostic methods. This is for diagnostic method systematic reviews. Then you're evaluating, but based on one specific topic, the diagnostic method. So you could evaluate clinical trials, cross-sectional studies, cohort studies, case control studies, but always focusing on diagnostic accuracy. This is important since you have, for example, here, this is the risk of bias for each study or within studies. And you have, for example, Mitchell, Perry, Jan, Van Dyck. And you have two important points here, the risk of bias and the applicability concerns, which is so important when you're applying the evidence for each study on your own patients. Then you have the patient selection or issues regarding patient selection, issues regarding the index test, issues regarding reference standards, and some issues regarding the flow and the timing in that study. So additionally, you have the most of the same issues for applicability concerns regarding the patient selection, the index test, and the reference standard. And looking to them on the other side, you could see the risk of bias, but based on the bias, the selection of the patients, the index test, the reference standard, and the flow and timing. It's getting everything but on the other way. The first one is based on each study, and the second one is based on the bias itself. This is called the QUADAS 2. Remember, the first one was the Haddad score for clinical trials. The second one was minors for non-randomized clinical trials, non-randomized studies. And you could get some other tools for assessing the risk of bias in non-randomized studies. But I think that one is a good one. And this one is recommended by Cochrane for assessing the risk of bias in diagnostic methods. Now, the topic what we're focusing on is the risk of bias tool for Cochrane, for clinical trials, for randomized clinical trials. We have 7 evidence-based domains. A group of people, they all were experts on systematic reviews, on methods, on some topics, and they created and validated this tool. So it has seven domains, and the judgment would be low risk or unclear risk. These are the 3 only classifications you could get on each issue that we're going to evaluate. And you always need to support what's your evaluation, what's the judgment for each issue on each clinical trial. So you write the statement between quotes and from the paper, and of course, if you'd like, you give an explanation why you get that kind of judgment. Then these are the domains. The first one is sequence generation. The second one is allocation concealment. The third and the fourth one are related to blinding. The first one is blinding of participants and personnel, and the fourth one is blinding of outcome assessment. The other one is incomplete outcome data, and the last one is selective outcome reporting. And of course, you could get a place to write down some other bias that you could find on your revision. The first two one are related to or are looking for selection bias. The third one is related to the performance bias. The other one is related to detection bias. The other one, attrition bias. And the last one for reporting bias. It's important for us to know about what we're looking for. This is just to remember, this is how a clinical trial is conducted. You have the target population, you get a bunch of people there, and you get the eligible ones, and then you allocate to the intervention group or the control group in a clinical trial with two arms. Then you follow up these people and you assess the outcome in each arm, and then of course you publish the study outcomes. The first two ones are random sequence generation and allocation concealment. Then for random sequence generation is regarding how was generated the randomization. How was the randomization method? Nothing else. You're not trying to blind anything or to ask for something else. It's only the method for randomization. And the allocation concealment is related to how you're going to avoid for other people to know what's the next assignment, what's the next allocation, what's the next allocation group. And these are two different points that must be written or described on the publication if we follow the PRISMA guidelines. And it is important for us to follow all those important guidelines. Just a few comments. Please check out the Equator Network. It's important for all of us to know how to publish the results of our investigations or our research. This is the way we assess the low risk of bias for the first item. It's the random sequence generation. This is the low risk of bias, and you need to find a process exactly described on the method section as referring to a random number table using a computer random number generation, coin tossing, shuffling cards or envelopes, throwing a dice, drawing of lots, and a kind of randomization called minimization. So if you get one of them, it's assessed as low risk of bias. Otherwise, it's another thing. For high risk of bias, you might get these different issues. For example, sequence generated by odd or even date of birth. Sequence generated by some rule based on the date or the date of admission. Sequence generation by some rule based on hospital or clinic record number, and so on. We have different ways to assess as high risk of bias for the randomization method. But remember, if you see it described, then you could assess as low risk or high risk. If you have to see it, it must be explicit. Otherwise, if you don't get the information to assess the quality of or the risk of bias, then you have to classify it as unclear risk of bias. Unclear is in every point that you don't get the information enough to assess the risk of bias. Then remember, you can get explicitly as high risk, explicited as low risk, but if you don't get enough information, you're having a unclear risk of bias. And that is for every single item there. The allocation concealment, you can get it here. For low risk of bias, you're having described as central allocation based on telephone or web-based, pharmacy control randomization, or sequentially numbered drug containers of identical appearance, or sequentially numbered opaque sealed envelopes. These three characteristics need to be explicitly described on the method section. That the envelopes were sealed, were opaque, and numbered, sequentially numbered. It's so important to be described there. The criteria for high risk of bias, then you have a lot of them. Using an open random allocation schedule, assignment envelopes were used without appropriate safeguards, alternation or rotation, date of birth, and you have a lot of them. And otherwise, you might classify it as unclear risk of bias. The other part is regarding the blinding for participants, personnel, and the blinding of the diagnosis. For blinding the participants and personnel, you have no one simple rule of thumb. You can't just say, hey, this is not good enough, or this is not correctly described. You need to assess it. You need to discuss it with the other assessor, and you need to think what's the impact of that kind of description, that kind of method for blinding, and or in the outcome. If the outcome is a subjective one, perhaps any variation of the method of blinding would affect the outcome. But if the outcome is an objective one, then perhaps, I'm just saying perhaps, any variation of the method of blinding wouldn't affect that kind of outcome. But you always need to assess it in a very good way and try to discuss with your partners or your team. Then, for example, here in the blinding of participants and personnel, you could grade as low risk if no blinding or incomplete blinding, but the review authors judge that the outcome is not likely to be influenced by lack of blinding, or blinding of participant and key study personnel ensured, and unlikely that the blinding could have been broken. It's important to remember that it's not enough just describing as single blind or double blind or triple blind. This is not what we need nowadays regarding the type or the method for blinding. We need explicitly describe the persons, the people blinded, and the method how they were blinded. So it's important for us to get that. And of course, we have high risk of bias also, and unclear risk of bias. And regarding the outcome of the assessment, it's almost the same, but you know, some people will conduct the study and administer the interventions, and some other people will assess the outcome. So it's important for us to know what are the methods for randomization, for blinding, for the personnel, for the investigators, and also for the assessor of the outcome. Another important topic is related to incomplete outcome data. Then you're gonna look for it on the figure 1, the flow chart in the consort statement for clinical trials. You're going specifically there. Otherwise, you need to go to the text, but of course you're gonna get the information there. And you might get a low risk of bias if no missing outcome data, yeah, or the reasons for missing outcome data are likely to be related to the true outcome. For example, for survival data, censoring isn't likely to be introducing bias. Missing outcome data balanced in number across intervention groups with similar reasons for missing data across the groups. And you know, you have different issues to assess as low risk of bias. And of course, you get the other ones on the contrary. You don't need to know them all. You just need to get the paper, and on the other side you have this kind of tool, how to assess the tool. And of course, if this is the first time you're gonna assess, please stay with the person that already knows how to do it. It's not difficult, but remember, this is so important for classifying grade, the grade tool that I told you before, and of course, for people to know the risk of bias of the information you're presenting to other people. So it's important to do it well. Selective reporting. This is another important issue to be careful, and it's regarding to we need to publish before the protocol of our clinical trials in this case. Remember that it's mandatory. It's mandatory to publish the protocol for clinical trials. That's something for the transparency of the research. So the study protocol needs to be pre-specified and published before, and then the outcomes need to be there. And if the protocol is not available, in some cases, you need to know that the outcomes presented in these clinical trials are the most important ones to apply on your patients. Those are the primary outcomes, and they're not presented just the surrogates outcomes or intermediate ones. And you have it here. If you have those two elements, then you could classify it as low risk of bias. And high risk of bias, you have different issues to check them out. Of course, if you don't have enough information to classify it, then the classification or the assessing for that item is unclear. And other bias are related, for example, to another potential source bias if the study has been claimed as fraudulent. I had in one systematic review, I found one clinical trial that I thought it was wonderful, it was perfect, it was the best evidence that I could get on that systematic review, but then a erratum got published in a journal, but by saying, hey, that clinical trial was found to be fraudulent. It was something not the experiments never were never done. So of course I didn't include that study in my systematic review. I just pulled it out and described this on the discussion section. That is important. Perhaps other bias could be regarding the inappropriate comparison between the groups. That would be important. Low risk of bias is not low risk of low sample size is not per se a risk of bias. You could write it down, but it isn't clear, and for Cochrane, it's not recommended to classify it as high, low, or unclear risk of bias in this issue. At the end, you're having this figure. We already saw one, but this one is for risk of bias within studies in clinical trials, and you could see here the random sequence generation, the allocation concealment, the blindings, the incomplete outcome data, and the selective reported and other bias. This is the bias within studies. This is important. And the other one is the bias across the studies. So the other one was based on each study, and this one is based on the bias itself. So you could see the high risk of bias in incomplete outcome data, high unclear risk of bias in allocation concealment, blinding, and you know how to interpret your results, and this is important for you to know. These figures are important for because they're so visually for people. It's important to visually understand what's going on with the results in the systematic review. Then you could get that information and translate it to the review manager, which is one of the most important programs to manage the systematic review. You have perhaps in the next session we would have the opportunity to open the review manager and see everything like this. This is like having the whole protocol and having the whole systematic review exactly as it must be, exactly as it should be. And then you enter the data for the studies, and you could classify specifically for the risk of bias. So it's really manageable, and it's a good choice for starting on systematic reviews, and for every person, no matter how experienced he is. This is how you might evaluate high risk, low risk, unclear risk, and between quotes, why we assess that way that issue, and this has to be done for each study. And of course, after getting this assessing of risk of bias, you get the most important outcomes, the critical ones and not critical ones and not important ones, and you could translate this to the grade pro in order to assess the quality of the evidence. And then you could get the evaluation for each outcome regarding the quality of the studies. Then these few take-home messages. Biased studies might lead to biased reviews, and that's not what we need or what we want. We have different tools according to the type of question, to the type of the design, and regarding the intervention reviews, regarding clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, it's this important tool that we focused on the talk, which has 7 domains. And remember, you just have to get the paper and get the tool, and you could start assessing the risk of bias. Describe details of what happened in each study. It's important for us. Remember, details matter. And consider the effect of the bias and be cautious when interpreting results. It's not just like saying, oh, this intervention is effective for. This intervention is not effective for. No, you have to just think about it just for a few minutes and analyze regarding the whole bunch of evidence and the bias of the evidence, and with grade or the quality of the evidence presented there. Well, thank you. Okay, let's follow and talk a little bit about getting to grade. Grade is an important tool to evaluate or to assess the quality of the evidence, and is linked to the risk of bias tool. Then this is just to remember. Of course, you have already got on your mind is formulated the PICO question, write in the protocol, get the literature search, then assess the abstract or get the abstract screening, the full text screening, the data extraction, the risk of bias assessment, the data analysis if this is possible, and then the grade to get the publication of a systematic reviews. Then if we have the results from our meta-analysis or our narrative reviews, we might get to different conclusions. But of course, getting there, it has some peaks and valleys to get very well evaluated and get the most of our results, and know how to apply that evidence on our patients. Then it's important for us to know the magnitude of the effect, if there is an effect or if there is not an effect. But of course, it's important for us to know how confident we are with our results. Then of course, we need to assess this, to assess the evidence in a very good way, please. For example, this we have the outcome was sleep disruption. The intervention was caffeinated coffee or decaf coffee, and then of course we have the results that sleep disruption increases by 25 more points from 18 to 32 with caffeinated coffee. Oh yeah, that's important, but how confident we are on those results, and that's what we're going to analyze during the talk. Here you have, for example, mortality at 12 months, and this is for other cancers than small cell lung carcinoma, and this is for small cell carcinoma, and this is for the total, the whole bunch of cancers, and you know, this is the intervention was heparin, and the other one was the control, the placebo or not intervention. And you have these results. This result is that heparin, the mortality between using heparin or not using heparin is almost the same in both groups. But in these two only studies for small cell lung carcinoma, heparin, giving heparin to this group lowers the mortality at 12 months. But are you confident that this is the true effect? What else around it? It is important to know that this was taken by for only 2 studies. This was for more studies. What is important in this another magnitude of the effect? For it is important to do a subgroup analysis as this is, or it's only important to analyze the whole bunch of cancers, but it's important to think about that. For example, in this case, small cell carcinoma behaves in different ways compared to the other kind of carcinoma. The first thing in the grade tool assessment is getting the Cochrane risk of bias tool. So you have to know what's the risk of bias for each study, and even for each outcome. Grade tool has something important. It is evaluated by outcomes, not by a study. It's based on the studies, but of course they have to form the outcome assessment. So we will have mortality, quality of life, and those important items. Since for us as a clinicians, as a healthcare provider, it's important to focus on the patient, not focusing on the study. So we need to assess the risk of bias tool. So that's the first thing. Then the talk we had before, you need to apply it. Thank you. The second important issue to evaluate in the grade is heterogeneity or inconsistency. So you have to get a meta-analysis to assess this. Consider only in meta-analysis, and of course you need to see the overlapping in confidence intervals, and of course you have different ways to assess heterogeneity, as the p-value for heterogeneity, and the most used one is the I-square. Remember, the I-square goes from 0 to 100%. Less than 50% is low heterogeneity, more than 50% is high heterogeneity, but you will find different ways to assess heterogeneity in the literature, and it's important for you to know how to do it and how to interpret that. If you can't find how to explain that I-square, that heterogeneity, you need to try to explore it by meta-regression methods or by subgroup analysis, or you have different choices in order to get to know how to explain that heterogeneity and try to low that kind of amount of heterogeneity. But inconsistency is the second important issue to have in mind when you're assessing the grade tool. The other one is publication bias. Publication bias is assessed by the funnel plot, which is a graphical method to assess it, or by different statistical tools like the Egger statistical. At the end, it shows a p-value, and some other. The other one is the Beck tool, and you might find different tools to evaluate the publication bias, but all of them have low power if you try to assess it in a very low number of studies. Cochrane manual says that it's not recommended if you get less than 10 studies included in your revision, in your review. So it's important if you assess it with a bigger review, a bigger number of review. Of course, you could get results less precise in those small studies that are not prone to be published. You could get less precise results than in large studies. That's something to be aware of, but we need to take them into our systematic review. That's why we try to saturate information and get the published and the non-published studies. And of course, those studies, those small studies, usually have non-significant results, and that's why some of the journals don't accept this kind of studies. This is for you to remember the funnel plot. This is like a funnel. This is like a funnel. The top of it is for low standard error or high sample size, and the bottom is wide, and it's the magnitude of the effect. So normally, the studies, the small ones that have different results, are the base of the funnel, and those studies that lead the magnitude of the effect and have a small standard error and high sample size are in the top of that funnel. And you see on the graph that these are it's like a spot there without any single study, and this is to represent those unpublished studies. But of course you need to evaluate if the search study was comprehensive, it was a really big one trying to look for the whole bunch of important studies, and if you're looking also for foreign language, it is important always to know that you can't only look for studies in English. You need to go in Spanish, you need to go in Chinese, in Japanese, in French. Of course, we could get information from those studies. So that's important for us to evaluate also. That's the third issue to assess the result bias in I'm sorry, the grade 2. The other important one is about precision or imprecision. One important thing in this item is getting if the sample size was important to detect the magnitude of the event or the number of the events, and this is according to the effect size, to control event rates, and we have one important way to evaluate that, since it's not common that every time we try to calculate the sample size when evaluating a clinical trial, then we have, for example, one tool. This is called the optimal information size, and you could use that kind of web-based calculator to identify if that number is important for the magnitude of the effect found in that kind of a study. The other important tool is getting the width of the interval. How is that confidence interval? Is very wide or is very narrow? And most of the time we could use that kind of rule of thumb. It's recommended by some people that you need to stay between the 0.75 or the other part is 1.25, but no more than that. Well, I don't think it's that easy, but it's one way to analyze the confidence interval. This is other way to see it. For example, you see these are examples of precision. You're getting the risk ratio, and then it's increasing the risk of something. This is precise. This is between the more than 1 and less than 1.25, more than 25%. For example, the other one is crossing the null effect, but is between the 0.75 and less than the 1.25. And of course we have different other ways to see if the results are imprecise. For example, crossing the null effect and and getting farther than 1.25, for example. And it's a very good way to analyze the imprecision. Is not that precise, but of course it's important for us to know. Regarding the other issue, is the indirectness. So you need to evaluate if or consider the extent to which you are uncertain about the applicability of the evidence to my clinical question or to my patients. How important is getting exactly the kind of patients that I have on the clinical question and the studies we included there. Of course, what we need to do is focus on the PICO question. Then if we did a very good systematic review, then the question to this, the indirectness, that won't be a problem for us. At the end, then we need to consider, when making conclusions, to the risk of bias, the inconsistency, the publication bias, the imprecision, and the applicability of our results or the directness of our results with our clinical patients or clinical settings. This is just to show that we have a PICO question, we have our systematic review, we have our studies, and then we focus on our outcomes. Then if we have our outcomes, then we have different studies for each outcome, and then we're going to grade specifically for each outcome. And of course, at the end, we're gonna have the classification for grade. What's the quality of the evidence that I have for each outcome? It's that, and it could be high, it could be moderate, low, or very low. This is one way to assess it. You know, every grade supports the issue that the clinical trials are the most important, and the observational studies are not good enough. Of course, it's not. It's important to correctly classify these kind of studies and the way we speak about them. Yeah, since of course we could find a very low quality clinical trial and a very good one observational study. And this is an example. Every clinical trial starts with a high quality of evidence, but you need to assess it. The risk of bias, inconsistency, indirectness, imprecision, publication bias. And if you find that something goes wrong, then you give a -1 point if it's serious, for example, or less than 2 points if that issue is very, very serious. The same for inconsistency, indirectness, imprecision, and publication bias. And of course, you're getting lower the quality of the evidence from high to moderate, low, or very low. But if you find an observational study, you start at slow, and if it has a large effect, then you could apply a +1 if the effect was large, a +2 if the effect is very large. If if there is an evidence of a gradient between the dose and the response for that intervention, and if all the confounding was taken away, you could apply a +1 point. And if you find any suggestion of a spurious effect, or if any confounding was taken away, you could add another important point. Then at the end, I know this table doesn't look good on your screens, but it's only for you to see how this looks like. The first column is related to the outcome, and it's presented how many studies are in each outcome. Then we have the whole assessing for the grade. Then we have the results, our results based on the each intervention, and regarding the relative risk and the absolute risk reduction. And at the end, with the support of Grade Pro, which is a web-based program that we use to assess the grade assessment, and we get the quality of the evidence as great, as high, medium, low, or very low. What does this mean? Then the quality of the high quality means that further research is very unlikely to change our confidence in the estimated effect. Moderate quality means that further research is likely to have an important impact on our confidence and may change the estimate. Low quality is that further research is very likely to have an important impact on our confidence and is likely to change the estimate. And very low quality, we're very uncertain of the confidence on this. Of course, we would like to have a strong recommendation about every intervention we have, but this doesn't occur. Of course, we would like in the near future to have this, but most of our quality of the evidence is based on moderate or low quality of evidence. Of course, we have a strong or high quality of evidence. However, is not the bunch of it. And to take home message, remember to go beyond the risk of bias. Is important for all of us. Right now, it's not mandatory to perform or to do the grade assessment. It's not mandatory. It's suggested. Is mandatory for Cochrane systematic reviews. Is suggested for the non-Cochrane. But try to think about in every step on systematic reviews, every detail matters. Grade Pro is a web-based important tool for us to assess the grade tool or the grade issues, and consider all items and be cautious when interpreting results. It's important to be cautious when interpreting. Remember that people usually just read very fast, but they don't focus on the important methodological things. So it's your responsibility to analyze in a very good way, take all the issues to try to conclude in regarding the quality of evidence, the risk of bias, and the applicability on our patients. Well, thank you for all your attention, and I hope to see you the next week. I hope you like all the talks. It's important for us at Universidad del Valle and UroScience at State University of Campinas. Thanks to all of you. Bueno, muchas gracias. Preguntas. Te estabas quedando dormido.